eager to hear this story. Nicole, it's all yours.
Thank you. Hey guys, thanks for having me. I guess everyone else out there will just stick with 4,000 Kelvin. So the Phoenix story, I don't think it's really a unique story, but I do want to emphasize a lot on community because that's really what got us over the finish line. But I want to start out first asking you guys if you've ever heard of the concept of complete streets. Is anyone? Oh, we have a few people. Great. Okay. What about CPTED, or crime prevention through environmental design? I've got a few people. Who's even heard of Jane Jacobs? Okay, it looks like some of the same people. So those three things I just brought up were fairly new to me at the beginning of this community advocacy for the 2700 Kelvin lights for Phoenix. And this is really what drew in a lot of Phoenix residents in interest of wanting what we considered better color lighting for our streets and parks. And to give you a little bit of background and context, it all began about, I think it was the beginning of 2016. Conversations started with city council and city staff and our neighborhoods. And City Council 9 months later voted for 2700 Kelvin lights. In the beginning, we had already began installing, I think, 4,000 Kelvin for 3 or 4 years. And that's kind of like a side story why we started going back to looking at other Kelvin levels. But 2700 Kelvin was actually not one of the options in the City Council's RFP request until a small group of people came forward and requested it to be in there. So of us, there was really just 3 of us, me being one of them, and Craig Weaver and Cindy Malicki, were the ones that haunted the halls of City Hall. But really the impetus behind all of this was our neighborhoods. I don't think that the neighborhoods really would have gained interest or traction behind this movement unless if we went out and educated them. We couldn't have done it without them, but really I don't think us wearing down our council members would have also been effective all on its own. So this was really a big group cohesion project, and I'm hoping that there's some things that you guys could take home with you. And I hope this actually will work. Let's see. So I'm going to jump right into who were our stakeholders, the big backers behind 27, whoops.
Touchy.
Okay. Okay, so I'm hoping this doesn't, I'm going to let go of it. So the big part of what gave us momentum were the various urbanism groups, I guess is what I could call them, and our neighborhood groups, our block watch groups. We even had a park conservancy board that's in downtown Phoenix area that backed this movement for the 2700 Kelvin. And then we had special interest groups as well, like the NOW group, National Organization for Women, Audubon, and there was even an open space preserve group in Phoenix that wrote a letter as well. But there was a letter that we submitted to City Council that had, I think it was 13 neighborhood groups, community groups, and a block watch group all back the 2700 Kelvin. And that became our baseline. We wanted 2700 Kelvin. We could have asked for 3,000 and or 27, but if you do that, quite often you're going to find that you're not going to get the baseline of what your desire is. You're going to probably get the one that's higher up. And in reaching out to the community groups, I have to say this was a very arduous process. I went and spoke to about 13 groups within, I think it was a month and a half or 2 months, working a full-time job. It became where I had no life other than, I mean, I had a life. This is actually very exciting. But really, when I had my dinners, I was sitting at these neighborhood meetings, waiting for my turn to speak. And I would come home and, go to bed, pretty much. So when we approached these neighborhoods, we had 2 other people on the sidelines that you don't hear about too often. So I mentioned myself, Cindy Malicki, and Craig Weaver. We also had Cindy's son, Jim Malicki, and Sean Sweat. They were very vital in us doing a lot of outreach to these groups because they already had a lot of connections to these neighborhood groups and getting us on their the community meeting agendas. And they didn't have to welcome us there if they didn't want to, but they were interested in hearing at least. So every time we would go to these community neighborhood meetings, we heard three main key points of interest. They wanted to make sure that their streets were still going to be engaged. They wanted a welcoming environment, but also an environment that felt safe. And they felt that 4,000 Kelvin, from what we knew was 4,000 Kelvin because we didn't have anything other than that, and we mostly had our HPS also, was not inviting. So they were interested in something that was more, I guess you would say, subdued. And they asked quite often about 3,000 Kelvin. And where we often found help is using a spectrometer. So at times where we could find, like there were a few demonstration spots in Phoenix where there's 3,000 Kelvin. They weren't always, oftentimes it was more than 3,000 Kelvin when those were installed. So we could have never guaranteed 3,000 Kelvin would be 3,000 Kelvin. So that's why we went with 2,700 when we spoke to the neighborhoods, mainly to keep in line with the AMA report. So these were the three main concerns in Phoenix, and I don't know if I could speak for other big cities, but I am from Houston. And being from Houston, I might be able to speak for them, but issues such as birds, wildlife, it's not really a concern. Even the stars, we didn't even bring up actually dark skies in our presentations. We stuck with the three main points because some people would say this is all well and good, but you know, who's going to help me when I'm looking at the stars and I'm being mugged? And these are just things that you will hear. Maybe sometimes it sounds extreme, but always these are things that you will hear. So you have to have a way of addressing your audience and knowing your audience before you go in. So knowing that, just having lived there for long enough, those were not talking points. And then with City Council often had the same topics of interest. Safety was a big one. They want to make sure their streets are safe. They want to make sure they get voted back into office. So if a constituent comes in and says, I care about seeing the night skies, they're like, that's great, but I think the majority of the people here are going to want to feel safe on their streets and in their neighborhoods. And they may agree with you that they wish they could see the stars as well, but the majority of people are going to be their constituents that they're going to be listening to. Another aspect was color renditioning. They were very curious about color renditioning with 2,700 Kelvin, so it did help to have a demonstration in our city. We had two spots that had 2,700 Kelvin in a demonstration next to a 3,000 and a 4,000. And then lastly, a big part was the socioeconomic disparity in Phoenix neighborhoods that are lower income. They tend to have smaller lots. So people are going to be closer to their streetlights. And oftentimes in Phoenix, we do leave our windows open, and not in the middle of the summer, but we will leave our windows open to cool down the house at night rather than turn on the AC. What some of these people were being told by city staff is, well, use blackout shades, which is a big issue. When we brought that up to City Council, you know, that's really disingenuous to tell your people to use that blackout shades when they're not necessarily doing it for sustainability reasons and keeping their AC off. It's for cost reasons. And so a lot of the smaller neighborhoods we were very concerned about and having those streetlights really close to the windows. Glare is always a big issue with our city council. Glare was a big part, mostly with drivers. We're mostly a driving city, but we do have a movement in the complete streets realm. So there's a lot of people who are cyclists and walkers, or people just use public transportation who are also concerned about glare and their own safety on the streets. So the main talking points and how we got to 2,700 Kelvin, and knowing everything that you know about our city council, which I think, as we know, those are universal concepts, safety and health. We talked a lot about mitigating glare, and we found and we believed, not everyone agreed, but this is a quality of life issue we're talking about, not necessarily a preference, was that 2,700 Kelvin would meet all needs as far as mitigating glare better than 3,035 or 4,000. We also had the complete streets movement, urbanism groups that wanted to make sure that we're creating a more inviting environment for pedestrians and other users. And then another aspect was the AMA report. That really resonated with a lot of city council members. But really it came to, well, why not 3,000 Kelvin? And thank you for Craig Weaver for having a spectrometer. He actually did go out to a lot of locations where we had installed, we being the city of Phoenix, 3,000 Kelvin, and every single time the readings were always over 3,000. So knowing that coming off the assembly line and installing directly, we can't guarantee people that 3,000 Kelvin will be 3,000. I think that's what made city council want to go ahead and just stick also with 2,700. And what we found in our approach in speaking with city council, neighborhood groups, community groups, regardless of who it was, you're going to get all sorts of concerns, whether we believe they're legitimate or not, whether they're backed behind science, backed with science or not, is to be empathetic and to listen and understand where they're coming from, because that's how you tend to win your audience. And always be resourceful. So before you go and approach, especially city council, if you email them ahead of time the information, that is really helpful for them, but don't expect them to have read it. They mean no offense by it. They just have a million other things going on and a million other people vying for their attention. But they always appreciate it. And if they're asking you questions, you're like, well, I sent you that over earlier. The best approach has always been, thank you for asking that, because they do have great questions. And you answer their questions the best that you can, and then you let them know that I did send over an email with information, so if you need that, or if I need to send it out again, let me know, because we're always here to help. And that's how we began a really good relationship with city council and staff. There were times where it wasn't always the most smoothest in our conversations. There weren't necessarily disagreements, but there were notions about things such as the moon. The moon is natural, and hey, the moon has a higher Kelvin level than, the 3,000 or 2,700, but I mean, we all know how that works. And so for whatever reason, one particular person who has the ears of city council quite a bit went with that, even though in discussions we proved them wrong. So we would find out and go into a lot of our own meetings where he was going to be out that those discussions still continued. So instead of fighting with someone like that, we just opened up to being a resource for city council as well whenever we could. Really just like disproving what was also shared by that person. Best thing when you go into a neighborhood meeting, for sure, because you're going to be inundated with questions afterwards, sometimes really interesting ones, is to always stick with 2 to 3 main key points. And I think we all understand that, but in a neighborhood environment, sometimes we want to go in with lots of issues, trying to grab in all sorts of different types of people, because they can be diverse audiences, but it still helps to stick with those 2 universal concepts of health and safety. But if anyone ever asks you off to the side about issues with dark skies, maybe they're interested, or the flyways with the migratory birds, and you have done your research, you can answer those questions. It's just not a main topic. So we would always answer those questions when we were asked, but we would always remind them, this is what our concerns primarily are right now with moving forward with the 2,700 Kelvin. Another thing is, I never have come across this in lighting so far, but I am a certified arborist by trade, and right now in Phoenix we're actually trying to push forward some ordinances to increase our tree shade canopy, and that's been pretty difficult. And in those debates, the thing I noticed that really will turn off city council or city staff, and you'll never win them back, is if you argue with them and if you sound elitist and act like they should know what you're talking about. It really will turn them off quick to your messaging. So be prepared for any questions to debate. Even though you're going out to there and you're invited or you're allowed to be on an agenda for a community group, don't expect for it to go very smoothly. There can be some really hostile environments, and oddly enough, I find it entertaining. One of the neighborhoods I went to used some amazingly lewd language, and the good thing is of the 13 I went to, only one was combative. Even though that environment turned a little bit, not hostile, but it was definitely combative, and some really creative words, colorful words came out of there from the president of the neighborhood. I still know that this person works really hard in making changes in their neighborhood, and they really were backing 4,000 Kelvin because this neighborhood is a high crime neighborhood and it's close to downtown, and they've been trying to revitalize it for years. So I understood all this, and it's not to say that his approach was necessary, but I didn't want to lose him. And even though his neighborhood never signed on, anytime I'm on social media or I'm at another community group now talking about trees, if he is there, he actually remembers me, and it's very cordial, and he seems to back me on anything I say, which has been great. Because after that meeting when he argued about the lights, and it was actually a few other people, I actually waited until everything was over, and I still thanked them for their time. And that could be very difficult to do, but we always have to remember they didn't have to give us their time. So it was a lot of lessons learned for myself and the rest of us, but these are the key things that we came home with that we realized towards the end of the finish line that really improved our communications overall. And some of the things I wanted to bring up, is anybody here involved in a block watch at all? Oh, we got one. Oh, that's great. Maybe two. So I actually was a neighborhood president of an association, which is different from an HOA, and we tend to focus on block watch strategies quite a bit. And in Phoenix, block watches are huge. Something that we do every year with the Phoenix Police Department is GAIN. It's called GAIN, but it's really like the neighborhood's night out that is celebrated nationally. And it's called Getting Arizonans Involved in Neighborhoods. And it tends to focus a lot on block watch strategies. And at these events, I always find that there's at least one officer and several people that still believe that you should direct your lights out and create glare, and that's a good strategy. But in going to these meetings and making friends that have become allies, I've noticed a small shift. Even though it's a small shift, it's actually made a big change now in our block watch grants. So when neighborhoods want to apply for block watch grants and they want to use some of that money towards doing lighting in their neighborhoods for what they call security lighting, and they now are highly encouraged, and it's in our language for the application, to meet the 2700 Kelvin guidelines and to also direct it so as to mitigate glare, to prevent any kind of glare towards drivers or pedestrians. So there is a small change that we're finding in our rhetoric also in Phoenix. But things are not always happening as fast. We still need to improve on our ordinances. We don't really have strong ordinances in Phoenix for lighting in general. Another thing to become familiar with are complete streets. So one of the biggest backers of this, who got me connected to a lot of our neighborhoods, is the president of a group called Urban Phoenix Project. And his name is Sean Sweat, who I'm now a board member of that group. He actually is the one that approached us because he happened to know Cindy Malicki's son, who I always describe him as a political strategist, Jim Malicki. And so they already had some connections, and these guys were phenomenal and kind of babysitting us through the process. But really, the process is everything I've shown you here. I think we would have been, at first we were like herding cats for them. I think it was a little bit frustrating, but we learned a lot from them. And in the complete streets concept, cities like Houston have even adopted this. They may not always focus on Kelvin levels, but glare is a big thing to them. So if you could talk about glare being better mitigated with a lower Kelvin level, that could grab their attention. It just takes education. And you have these big groups in cities like Seattle, Los Angeles, New York City, that have a complete streets program. If they don't, they're definitely pushing towards one. And Jane Jacobs is actually an activist that's from New York City. Back in the 50s or so, she was an advocate for the neighborhoods. And she pushed back quite a bit to the city departments who thought they knew what was best for city dwellers in revitalizing neighborhoods. So a lot of what her concepts are, she actually was in favor of good lighting and appropriate lighting. So a lot of her concepts are adopted into complete streets. This is a tool I highly recommend. And it's not to say that this is better than, working with Audubon on the birds, but if you're coming up to some speed humps in your process and getting communities to listen or council to listen, Complete Streets has an avenue for you to actually integrate something that could work and be in alignment with our dark skies. The same goes with the crime prevention through environmental design. That is a strategy for crime prevention that essentially is to invite more eyes to the street. And same with Complete Streets. They want more eyes on the streets. They believe that is the most effective thing for crime prevention. It's a passive crime prevention. And better eyes on the streets means people are gonna have their window shades open. But when you have intensive glaring lights, maybe they should be shielded also, you're not gonna have eyes on the streets. Because we all know that lighting, essentially, without effective eyes to see, does light cast light, not for practical reasons. And that's something that Jane Jacobs really believed in. And this is really what helped us get across the finish line for getting City Council on board, was knowing that we appreciated and respected safety of all of our residents and also the health aspect. So I would like to say that, you know, it was really the three of us, but it took a lot from other people that are beyond even the five of Sean Sweat and Jim helping. But the neighborhoods are really excited that we went with 2700 Kelvin. So now we're actually installing this in our streets starting the beginning of 2017. But this is really all we've done. So we haven't ever approached yet about the dimming, because the RFP process already was going. So it was only about the Kelvin level. But that's something we hope to approach soon. A lot of us, we have limited bandwidth, so it's been real difficult in finding the time to reapproach City Council, but hopefully here soon, we will be able to do that. We're just waiting for our new mayor to come in, actually. So, and that is it for my presentation. So thank you.